I brought in a blueberry quick sour ale. It's a wheat beer similar to like a Berliner Weiss base beer that I picked. I picked some fruit. About 15 pounds of blueberries were put into about 5 gallons of wort or aging beer, and then blended down with a second batch made at another point in time, but with the same base wort, and then blended to what we have here. But anyhow, I guess I'll kick it off. So today I'm talking to you guys about quick sours, is how I define them. So first things first, agenda. So here's what I'm hoping to get out of this and what I'd like you guys to get out of this.
Get out of the way.
Move out of the screen. Sorry. So I want to go over my personal background, my history as far as it comes to brewing. Why do I brew beer? What do I like about brewing beer? And kind of how that influences what I've been doing recently. I want to talk a little bit about sour beer and define what sour beer is for us before we launch into what a quick sour beer is. I'm going to then define for us what a quick versus what I call a complex or a careful sour would be, primarily due to lead time, but we'll get into that. Then I want to define some of the lactic acid bacteria that are necessary to making these styles of beers. And then lastly, I just want to kind of talk through my typical process, how I make these beers, and then we can get into any questions that you guys have about any of those. All right.
Quit running away.
All right. So warning, this is just a dogma alert. So beer is something that is very personal. Everybody has their own approaches, and I don't think that there's any true approach, probably not dissimilar from life. So for me, this is what I've found with my sour beers. Sour beer, even more so, I've found is really like an art form at some level. There's still science and engineering, which a lot of us like, and tinkering, but there's a little bit more nuance is what I find. So my background in brewing started about 8 years ago. I went to a large state college, Penn State University. I drank a fair amount of beer there. I started to like it, and around my junior year, I decided, along with the encouragement of a friend, maybe we could make some. Our first kit, we actually bought a Brooklyn brew shop homebrew kit, and bought an actual triple recipe, all grain, with it, straight away. And we brewed in a bag, and we're reading the John Palmer book at the time, mostly on the toilet. That's where we kept it. Anyhow, so kind of the next steps. After a few successes, and thankfully the first triple was a success, I moved home after college. I thought I was going to move internationally to work, but instead I ended up finding a job with Swagelock, and at that time I got really into YouTube channels, one of them being Brewing TV. Brewing TV was a channel put out by Northern Brewer, which still makes beer, or beer products, and they put out an episode about sour beer, and I hadn't even heard of it at the time. At that point, I went to the store, and that weekend I had like 5 sour beers. The first of which being a Rodenbach vintage single barrel from 2011, of which I opened. It's a Cajun Cork 750 large format bottle by myself, and almost didn't drink all of it because I didn't like it. Needless to say, I continued to develop a palate for sour beer on a trip in 2015 to Belgium. Where every day I drank probably one of my favorite breweries, Cantillon, one of the largest, well not largest, one of the most famous lambic producers in the world. But anyhow, that trip really inspired me and kept me on my journey of brewing sour beer. The biggest problem was I couldn't get enough of it fast. Okay, jumping into some history though. So sour beer, the way I define it, sour beer is a beer with tartness as a flavor component, typically created due to the presence of a lactic acid bacteria in the inoculant. So really, the only defining thing is that lactic acid bacteria to me. That's what drives the flavor and really creates the unique profile. Starting back in time, we discovered beer around 9,000 years ago, and up until the mid-1700s, all beer was sour, meaning that we couldn't control what was making the beer. Even further, we didn't even know what was making the beer, which I always think is cool. But anyhow, until this gentleman, Louis Pasteur, came along with the help of some financial backing by Carlsberg Brewing Company. The head brewer there wanted to get rid of the spoilage bacteria, including the lactic acid bacteria, and he wrote a book essentially discovering the field of microbiology and creating isolation of single culture yeast, which is also, to me, this is also what really drives what I think is cool about beer. Moving into closer to the present, the three main countries that really have driven sour beer production within the world have been England, Belgium, and Germany. So those countries really carried the torch or the flame of that tradition of not controlling everything in the inoculant base from about that mid-1800s, 1876 through to the 1990s. These breweries made a lot of the famous European ales that you'll find in 2015 GABF guidelines, or BJCP guidelines rather, and GABF. But Belgium, known for its wheat beers in the central region and southern region, with Lambic and Saisons, Lambic being sour, Oud Bruins and Flanders Reds being from the northern region, the Flemish region also being sour. Germany made in the northern region Berliner Weiss and Gose, also both wheat sour beers. And then England, the sour beers were made more so over time in stock ales, and not all of them were infected with lactic acid, but some of them were. Moving into the present is really where I came into this. So recently there's been a surge in sour beer activity and really a revitalization of what I feel like is going back to the roots of what humanity used beer kind of as. But anyhow, it started in 2002 with the first GABF sour beer category, which to me, when I read that, it blew my mind that that's how recent these beers have come into popularity. With that picture, however small it is, of La Folie, the original beer by the Belgian Brewing Company. For those of you who don't know, Peter Bockhart, who no longer is with New Belgium just as of last year, but Peter Bockhart studied brewing with Rodenbach, Rudy Jaffe, or I forget how you say his last name, but he studied there and then started the beer movement with that beer, winning the title in 2002. As of 2013, there's now 6 sour beer categories, and there were 238 entries in that year in comparison to 4 for the 2002 year. Just recently I read an article last year 19% up, or no, it's more than that. I think it was 30% up in sales at the retail level of sour beer. So it's just something that we're seeing more, and it's something that I think we can all be doing if we want to. So speaking to lead time, the traditional styles are primarily more of what I would define as complex, meaning that they would take longer than the amount of time that the primary driver of the alcohol production would take. So a quick sour would be anything that would take the same amount of time or a similar amount of time, what the primary driver of alcohol activity would take. Additionally to that, the primary reason that complex sours take a long amount of time is typically due to the lactic acid bacteria used. So there's two main types of lactic LABs, is what I'll just say because I'm struggling over it so much. But there's two main types of LABs. There's lactobacillus, which is found in primarily dairy products, so yogurt. It's what makes yogurt taste tart, and why I like yogurt. Pediococcus is the other type of lactic acid bacteria. That type of bacteria is primarily found, or we think of it a lot, in sauerkraut. It's what makes sauerkraut taste good. I also really like sauerkraut, being Slovak. Anyhow, some of the other things about these bacteria, their temperature ranges tend to be, they tend to prefer higher temperature ranges. So above 100 degrees is still good for these bacteria. Most of them, as you can see, they align to about 100 degrees. So if you're in that 100 degree mark for these, you're probably giving your lactic acid the best chance to really grow and thrive.
How do you get your shit up to 100 degrees?
That's a good question.
Put it in
so,
your eye.
So I'll get to that in the process point, but
Okay.
but if I don't cover it, then feel free to ask again. IBU tolerance is a big thing when it comes to lactic acid bacteria. So lactobacillus has low tolerance, whereas Pediococcus tends to have higher. So there's been beers made with Pediococcus up to 30 IBUs, which is quite high. It's probably about a low pale ale. But whereas lactobacillus, one thing that I think is cool about quick sours is people always say, stay away from sours. You'll mess up your gear, your cold side equipment. I would just point to one thing, and it would be approximately 8 IBUs is how many IBUs is the tolerance, the intolerance of lactobacillus. So how many of us brew beers below 8 IBUs? So there are people, but I would argue, I brew a lot of beer with age tops, but those are about the only beers that I brew without 8 IBUs in them. Tim?
So what in house destroys the lacto then?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't done enough research on
The
that.
hop oil bacterial status.
But I would guess it might be something to do with oils.
I don't,
Yeah, I'm not
because it's
sure.
not a pH thing, it can't be a pH thing. Because it's already, lactobacillus brings the pH down.
No, it's definitely due to the hops, which is why hops eventually found their way into beer.
Retard the LAB lactic generation. That's all. And lacto, 8 IBUs or 8 to 10 is what a lot of people have been thinking. But you can train your lactic.
Yeah, that is a good point.
And so there are some sour brewers that are training their strains to be more IBU tolerant.
Yes, that's a good point, and that leads well into the ABV tolerance, similar to the IBU tolerance, and similar to the pH tolerance, and I would argue similar to all yeast. You can morph it into what you want over time by giving it the right amount of stuff. One thing that I listen to a lot is the Sour Hour, and they did this one Sour Hour, which is a podcast with Upland Brewing Company in Indiana, and Upland Brewing Company makes a ton of really great sours, predominantly inspired by the lambic tradition. But they were doing these experiments on their lactobacillus strain because they made this really dark sour ale that they couldn't get to bottle condition correctly, and essentially they just had to train it iteratively over time. And they worked with the Bloomington, Indiana University to accomplish that. But certainly really cool. I think that these are also really good survivor bacteria, which is also something that I think is something that motivates me, or I think is cool about using them as part of the bacteria, or as part of my beer profile. Additionally, they're probiotic, which theoretically should be good for you. I think that there were historically health benefits to having these bacteria within beer, and reasons why we have traditionally ate fermented foods. Jumping into my typical process, so I put the first bullet as a question mark because I don't follow processes that well, is what I find. So pre-acidify my wort, I do it most of the time, but I've been known to forget it sometimes. So that's just a reference to adding lactic acid to bring my wort down to an appropriate range to eliminate the possibility of like Enterobacter and some other nasty bacteria from getting into the beer. Because one thing about having that, achieving that higher temperature range that is necessary to create lactic acid quickly, it puts you a little bit more at risk to some other harmful bacteria that also grow really fast at that range. What I found is adding lactic acid, I typically, again, this is why I put a question mark, I'm not the best at measuring sometimes, so I typically put about a teaspoon per 5 gallons is what I'm rocking right now. I haven't been doing, I have a pH meter. I haven't been checking my pH to bring it down right now. That's also why it's in question, mostly due to laziness. I haven't had any problems yet also, that's why the laziness is there. What's up, Mike?
Is that a teaspoon per 5 gallons or a teaspoon per 10?
It might be.
I mean, what's your boil size?
My boil size is typically 10.
Okay.
And I'm typically, yeah, you're right. I'm typically just putting in 1 for that batch.
Okay.
And that shakes out. That's been working well. And I haven't, because you can get some negative effects too, potentially from.
3 milliliters maybe, right?
It could be about 3 milliliters. Yeah. What I would point you to, and you'll see my sources at the end. I would point you to this resource. One of the best resources that I find for studying things sour or things funky, as they would probably spin it more so, is Milk the Funk. They're a Facebook group that also has a wiki page that has some of the best information about sour out there that I've found. There are also a lot of other good books, but it aggregates a lot of knowledge, and it has some of the best people within the world that are producing beer commenting on it, which is just, I think, a really cool opportunity that is the time that we live in, I guess. But so stepping out of my wort treatment, so everything about my brew day is basically the same when I brew a quick sour. I brew everything the same except for I bring down my wort by acidifying it. I bring it up to a boil. Once I get it to a boil, I add, if I'm going to be making a goza or something with some sort of adjunct, I would add my adjunct then, or my hops at the boil point. At that point in time, I add my chiller, almost as if it's a typical 15-minute mark in your brew day. I don't really sanitize it typically for 15 minutes. I start to chill it immediately. I bring my temperatures down to about 115 Fahrenheit. At that point, that's
Right.
yeah.
You're not doing an hour boil or anything.
No. So traditionally, when I make my beer, my quick sours. I primarily make beers inspired by the northern German tradition of like top fermented sours. Although I just recently read that gozas were originally spontaneous ales, and that blew my mind. But anyhow, so I mostly make like wheat beers that are not boiled. I've made a few other quick sours. Those I have also not boiled. This is also another reason why I think this is a great first beer for people. These are like my quickest brew days. I can make this beer in like 60 minutes on brew day, which is pretty sweet. Especially if it's extract, and then it's like it's just as fast as I can take to heat up my water, basically.
You don't boil, so you just bring it up to...
I just bring it up. It's essentially pasteurizing it, and then and then I'm just bringing it down to 115. at that point in time, that's when I start racking out of my vessel. I rack into my sanitized fermenters, whatever I'm using. At that point, I keep a lactobacillus culture, which started off as a mixture of things, but it started off using Omega Labs 604 pack, which I would highly recommend. That's one of my favorite lactobacillus blends. I also put in both of the varietals of lactobacillus from White Labs in the vials in a separate growler. So I just keep 2 growlers of like very neutral wheat wort, about 1.03 gravity, and just always keep those kind of in a cellar temperature. So on brew day, once the wort it's about, because it's coming out of the brew kettle at 115, it's probably about that 110 to 100 range by the time I'm getting into the fermenter. By the time I'm putting the lacto in, I just shake it up, put it in, and then use the extra wort to refill my starter wort for the cultures. And then the last step would be just sealing it off to the environment, and then waiting until that pH, I typically target a pH of about 3.6 is achieved. So for that, I've been using a pH meter, but again, I'm not the most fastidious with taking notes or diligent about taking readings. So I've been known to just let it go about 12 to 48 hours is when I come back in, and that is when I find that the beer is sour to my liking. And because I make enough of them, I typically blend a lot of my beers together, so I can adjust from there. But that's just typically, so this slide, from me adjusting the wort and doing all the mash processes and slight boil, it's not too long, and then the target pH is typically achieved the next day. And then the last step to make the beer would be once I achieve my pH, that's when I add my yeast. So whatever I'm determining is what I want to bring down and try to create some yeast profile flavors from. That's kind of the yeast I use. It typically is like Saccharomyces bruxellinus traw. I really, really like that yeast character. But that's just for what I make. This can be done with any style of beer for any type of wort. So you could hop if you wanted to. The thing is, you wouldn't be able to hop up front in the boil because you would prevent that lactobacillus, if you were using lactobacillus, from growing lactic acid. So if you want to add hops to lactic acid beer or quick sours, what you could do is, and I've done this with some batches, but not a lot, is after you add your lacto, you can re-put it back, take it out of the fermenter, re-put it back into your brew kettle, and boil it. That will kill the lactobacillus. You could then, at that point, you could add your hops then, and see what it did. I find that it's tricky. I think a lot of people find that it's tricky to balance hops with tartness, but it's something that when I found it achieved, like there's been a few beers that have really wowed me. Tim, and then.
Have you ever? Go ahead. Your name's Tim, I guess. Have you ever used wormwood?
Go ahead, Dennis.
Have you ever used wormwood? Have you played with that at all?
No, I've never used wormwood. No.
He's talking about lactobacillus. Why would you? No, I mean for bittering.
Oh no. Oh, that's actually a good idea.
Oh, you mean instead of hops?
Yes.
Okay.
Because
so it doesn't kill the lactose.
Yeah,
That makes sense, but you could do rye.
Thank you, Dennis.
All right, go ahead, Tim.
So, do we know if lactose produces any kind of alcohol?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I didn't scope that in, but there's 2 types of lactobacillus. There's homofermentative and heterofermentative. Yeah, so heterofermentative is capable of producing ethanol and CO2, really small trace amounts of ethanol, not enough to drive down a beer. to full fermentation, but small amounts. So if you were to have a homofermentative lactobacillus during that time period when your lactic acid is going, dissimilar from like a typical yeast fermentation, you wouldn't see any output. Like there would be no real feedback to you that it was doing anything other than if it was clear. I find that like, at least with the strains that I use, that pellicle forms, which I'm not sure how many of you have seen them, but they look kind of like little bubbles, or I find a lot of mine look like little bubbles kind of floating on the surface of a liquid, kind of soapy, scummy looking.
That's more PDO though, right?
PDO can cause, also puts off pellicles, but I find that my lactobacillus does as well. They look different, is what I find. When I see my PDO, it's a little bit thicker, is what I see on the top of them. And then also, you'll never encounter, or at least not to my experience, I've never encountered like ropiness, or like you'll get, like in my lambic inspired beers, like at least in the ones that I can see through them, the carboys, you can see stringers in them occasionally floating down, and those are characteristic of pediococcus, and that's typically why traditionally like complex sours, because they use pediococcus, a lot of times they use Brettanomyces as well to help clear up that, like, because typically over time that ropiness goes away, but it takes time, and then from what I've read, Brettanomyces does help drive some of that
And will produce
away.
alcohol. So if you're seeing the wort roll, I mean actually ferment, you're actually visualizing, that's the one that's not producing alcohol?
No, so that would be the one that is. So you wouldn't see it rolling, at least I haven't seen it, but most of these are in plastic
Yeah, my first one was
fermenters.
rolling, I mean it was
But
actually
no, you could see you just see bubbler activity. So imagine a heterofermentative lactobacillus, you'll see CO2 activity.
the only thing in there?
Yeah.
Because lactose is the only thing at the time.
747.
So at that point, the lacto, like heterofermentative lacto, causes CO2 output, which then will cause your bubbler to look like it's fermenting, but it's really just slightly outputting CO2.
Well, this was in an open fermenter.
If it were in an open,
It was in an open fermenter. This happened to me.
Oh, okay.
So it was, you can tell, I mean, you had active fermentation. It was rolling. I mean, no kreuzen or nothing, but it was rolling. Okay, and I went down almost, I'd say 38, 40 gravity points. Okay? And it was supposed to be a...
Yeast infection.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious. I haven't read anything about full fermentations with lactobacillus, but maybe it's feasible. I
Don't
don't
you
know.
have some yeast in, like, I mean, is it yeast and bacteria or just bacteria?
Traditionally, well, that's a good point. So my cultures have blended over time. So typically when I put my cultures in, there theoretically is Saccharomyces within it.
Because how do you keep it from turning into
That was the first,
kombucha?
that was the one we made for Jack.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, or do you mean becoming too lactic acid dominant?
right.
So I've refreshed my culture a few times now.
They often have
Yeah.
yeast in with their
Go ahead, Paul.
which is not
You know,
supposed to be.
you're using, like Brett,
So it wouldn't have been a bad
yeast to ferment later.
flavor.
Will standard ale yeast ferment something with a pH that low?
That's a good question. So Paul just asked, would standard ale yeast be able to ferment at pHs that low? And I think the answer is I'm not going to know definitively for every yeast, but I would just do the research on what the pH tolerances are of that yeast strain. I don't think that all of them are capable, but I think that, not dissimilar from these bacteria, I think that there's a chance it's slowly introduced over time. If you really were like, I want this lager yeast to be able to handle pH tolerance, like I think you could slowly introduce it to it.
I mean, I've only tried it for Belgian yeast, and they
Really?
seemed okay. I was just thinking,
No,
like a Weizen yeast or something that
No, that's a
die off
good.
immediately.
That's a good question. I'd be interested to see us experiment with that. I've done some Trappist ales with it. I've done Belgian ales. I've used American ales actually. I used one once, but mostly I stick to that sack draw. But that's because I'm making a lot of the same styles, and I just like that character. Anything else? Any other questions? These are just what I primarily used, at least as far as like facts. What's up?
When you were in Belgium, did you find a lot of the producers were blenders in Belgium?
Yeah.
And what like percentage? I was surprised when I read that, and then I thought, well, that makes sense because it's so hard to
Yeah, I agree.
the wild fermentation and everything. But is that like 20% or
No, so at least
50%?
to the best of my knowledge, so what you're talking to, those types of beers would be your Flanders Reds, Oud Bruins, and your Lambic beers, and I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. Yeah, 100% to my knowledge of those producers are blending those beers.
Actually, that's not exactly what I mean. I mean, I get the impression some of the producers are like buying their beer and.
Oh, okay. You're talking to gooseries.
Okay.
So that's a super cool idea too.
Okay.
So that's something that there are gooseries. So that would be like Tillaquin is a really popular example of them. So they their business model is it really intriguing to me. But their business model is they buy wort from traditional lambic. Most of them Horal, but not all because they buy from Cantillon. But mostly lambic producers, and they buy their wort, bring it in on tankards or whatever form that brewer they negotiate, and then they actually inoculate the wort on their own at the goosery, and then they put it into barrels traditionally, oak barrels, and then they own everything from the fermentation phase on through the blending and packaging phase. Yeah, that's definitely something that's done. And they also traditionally, it's really popular to add fruit as well, as in the lambic tradition. Mm-hmm. What's up, Karen?
I know you played with a lot of fun ingredients.
Yeah.
What have you really found worked with sours, and what flavors did you find
Didn't work? I wish I had more instances of crazy ideas, but mostly what I've been struggling with is getting the right levels of fruit. So for me, fruit is the primary adjunct that I choose to play with when it comes to sours right now. There's a little bit of I have one complex beer that I really like playing with roasty character with, and I like playing a lot with tannin components within beer. But mostly it's fruit, and the challenges have been berries are my favorite in general, and figuring out how to get enough berry character with only using real berries, but still getting the tartness to the level that I want, and really getting somebody to say or think to themselves that was a blueberry, or that tasted like blackberry. If I tell people afterwards and they get it, that's good, but I want them to almost say it before I told them. So that's probably where I'm still figuring it out. I've been adjusting my amounts of fruit consistently over time, but I think it's challenging being as small as we are when it comes to things like that, because the purchasing power and getting access to the best fruit is difficult, just not dissimilar from hops. The reason why it's more challenging to make really great IPAs, I feel is we're almost last in line when it comes to access. So when it comes to fruit, it's not as bad, but when I picked 63 pounds of blackberries this past year, and like I just picked the whole field. Like I didn't get to choose what the condition of the field was. Most sour beer producers build relationships with their farms years out, and they get to even tell the farmers like leave the berries on the plants until they're like ripened to a certain point. But still, those are excuses and things I'm trying to figure out. What's it? Yeah, I do gotta grow berries.
What do you do to the fruit itself?
Traditionally, when I add fruit, like the beer that we consume today, and I wanted to bring in a Goza originally, but I didn't. I went to New York and didn't carbonate it this weekend. But this beer I fruited by picking the berries at like Voitka Farm, which is out just east of Aurora. I take the berries straight from the farm, rinse them, put them, like destem what's left to destem, put them into just a food processor, blend them down into like pretty close to a fine juice. Take the juice, put it into sanitized Ziploc bags, typically a gallon size. Put those into like one of my freezers, freeze them. Once I freeze them, then it's kind of like I can wait until my beer's ready, or if my beer's ready, I can then put them in. Then from there, I typically thaw them, and then just I normally put them in the fermenter first. I've been using buckets mostly, but then rack wort on top of it. And then, like for instance with this one, like I said, it was more fruit than, more fruit in the first, and then I blended it down a little bit. So that's where I always kind of am debating whether to, which level to let the fruit kind of remain at in the end product.
So no concerns about wild yeast on this?
Well, that's why
Pasteurize the fruit?
That's why I freeze them. So the freezing is at least from what I've read, that's supposed to kill most of the harmful bacteria within them. And then the risk is actually bringing them up to thaw point. I mean, I try to put them in as early as I can.
So you, this is real nice. I like this.
Thank you.
But you could not share a recipe for making this beer because this is blended from 2 or more other different brews.
I can tell you the recipe. So that's a 60-40 beer. So it's 60% Pilsner malt. I've been using recently when I do all grain batches. I started only sourcing from house malts because I primarily make a lot of traditional lambic inspired beer, and I really like the idea of like beer from where you're from, so close range ingredients. But then I also buy raw wheat from Ohio through house malts, and I've actually been using mostly just raw wheat in these beers, and no malted wheat. But that's just my personal preference. I've seen that I really took this recipe straight from Milk the Funk, their Goza website. The first batch of Goza I did was I bought 2 bags of the Belgium DME, put it into hot water, and like made Goza. And I brought it into this club, and I remember Todd being like, "This was really good." And I made it in a literally this beer I recall specifically making it in less than a month. So to me, this is just why I think that these beers are it's silly that there's this notion that they're challenging to do. Mm-hmm.
So when you're blending it, I mean, you're adding like a lot of oxygen to like the fruit. So then you add that to like the beer, so you're adding oxygen or air to the fruit. I mean, do you notice something good or bad because of that?
I guess no, I haven't yet noticed anything bad. There's definitely oxygen risk. I don't blend anything with like closed system yet, even in my complex sours, which is definitely a risk. But I haven't had any problems.
The low pH and the low hop level is going to help protect you.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Some of those oxidative qualities. I mean, of course, the malt's going to be, but that low pH and the fact that you don't have the hops, which are so prone to oxidation, like I think that's a little bit of a protection there.
So, and if you have any acetobacter, you'll get just a little bit of that character. You get a little bit of acetic character as well. That'll eat up the oxygen. So,
yeah, that would be a risk. Yep. I haven't had too many problems with, in my experience, with certainly none with the quick sours, but in my complex sours, a few of my batches have had too much acetic acid, and I've had to dump it before.
So
What about the baby diaper?
I do a Flanders Red with a Solera. And so I'm blending stuff that's several years old. And my oldest carboy I keep with just a cork rather than a tight air seal, because I actually want a little oxygen in there to pick up some acetic. So there, a little acetic is pleasant in that style. So oxygen there is okay. But again, when I make a batch of that, when I keg off a batch, I'm working from three different carboys into the blend. So again, you can tailor how much of that acetic character you want and how much of the young beer you want.
Agreed. Yeah. Go ahead, Mike, and then Dennis.
I just want to ask you how you're using the raw wheat when you make your beer. Like, how do you have? Does it mill the way?
I typically mill it finer, so I adjust my settings a lot lower. When I'm doing my
kernels smaller than what you're getting, or?
the kernels are way smaller.
I heard it breaks your rollers too. It's really hard
It's
to roll.
really hard on your rollers. Yes, these are true. It takes a lot longer.
Do you hydrate it?
Do I hydrate it when I'm using it?
Before you mill it.
Before I mill it? No, I do not.
You should try that.
Have you used that rye that way?
You spray it.
That rye, I also use that way, yeah. But yeah, I don't know, so far, I mean, those are definitely, disadvantages to using it. I found in these quick sours, it definitely, I'm using more of it and I don't get nearly as much, it doesn't provide much sugars for me to really ferment with. I do really like the mouthfeel of it. I just do it a lot of the time, quite frankly, because the way that I brew, it's not convenient. I'm not advanced planning enough for a lot of the homebrew shops here, where when I go to a store, I typically, if I were to do this without raw wheat, I would do flaked wheat. And I buy out stores of flaked wheat. I come in and there's no flaked wheat. So it's just challenging because a lot of times I'll go and they don't have 10 pounds of flaked wheat and that's how much I need, and then it's oh shit. So sometimes I'll split and do flaked wheat and raw wheat, a little bit of them. I don't really too much care about how strong the beers are, and I know that I can adjust for that. I just like my beers, this beer for instance, I think was in the mid 4s. I just want something that's kind of poundable and slightly tart and refreshing. When it comes to making these, at least. So that's what I've found has been good for me. Anything else? Oh yeah, Dennis. Sorry.
What's ABV on your beer?
Oh yeah, this beer. It's about 4.4 around there, 4.5, something like that.
Don't they stay in the 5.5 range or something like that?
No, I mean I've made these to be higher, but traditionally I'm not the best at knowing all this. I'm not the best style person, but I think Berliner Weisses and Gozas are known to be a little bit on the lower end. So starting at 3.5 to probably maybe 5.1 is what I think.
I would even go lower than that. Sometimes 2.5.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, sometimes they're really like a Berliner Weiss is almost like soda for them, because they would put syrup in it, and then that's really a soda with slight alcohol level in it.
Yeah, you can get Kinder beer size.
Ginger beer.
So your alcohol comes from
Some yeast, right?
Yeah.
After
Yeah, once the target pH is achieved, that's when the yeast goes in and does its job just like
your
normal.
fruits are berries largely, right?
Yeah.
You haven't messed with pineapple or
Man, I can imagine.
No.
papaya or
No, the most extreme fruits that I've done have been, I do like tropical fruit, that's why I like Gozas so much, and I think that some of the fruits that I think would be the best in sour beer, and if anybody wants to go in on a box of this with me, I'm game, it would be passion fruit. And but it's $200 to get a 40-pound bag, but if anybody wants half of it, or even a quart of it. I would buy 3/4 of it.
So if you not a bunch of sugary fruit, at the end, do you do it, or?
Yeah, I typically do it in secondary fermentation.
And the yeast then would, take over.
Mm-hmm. There's typically a second re-fermentation on the
You get
fruit.
a large boost in alcohol content.
So I've done some reading on that, and there's debate as to how much that influences the beer. But yes, it does influence. Mike.
So one of the ways I've been getting fruit, or last year what I did was, I really wanted to use Pluots in my lambic. Pluots.
Fluids, they're a mixture of.
They're a hybrid plum and apricot.
Yeah, they're really cool. That's a trending thing right now within the sour community.
So anyway, I just went down to the West Side Market. I went when I assumed that like a Monday morning or whatever, when things were going to be a little slower, so I could talk to a fruit vendor and say, hey, I see you've got these, can I buy a case off of you? And this is why I want to use it. And he gave it to me at like a case plus like $5.
Really?
Really. So
Okay.
you might be able to do that if you want to get papayas instead of buying.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, because my common source would be Miles Farmers Market. So I bought a lot. I do a lot of kiwi fruit there. Or recently, and I'm planning on bringing this to the club meeting. I took the Brett saison that I was given, and I took 20 pounds of mangoes, and same thing, just pureed them, and I put them into about 5 gallons of that beer to see what that.
What's a good way to get the flesh off of a mango?
There's no good way to get the flesh off of a mango.
I thought you had to practice.
That was good. No, it's terrible. It's terrible. So my roommate's brother went to this Culinary Institute of America, and so they really are nerdy about cooking. And he showed me how to cut them with his knife set, like his chef knife block. And it was basically, there's no good way, just like hope you get this green part as precisely as possible. Yeah. Anyhow, anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
So what would be the difference between using fresh fruit and making your own puree, rather than just buy a can of puree?
I think really no difference. For me, it's probably just like my obsessive, like I really like to control things, that, even though I can't. But I really, so for me, the fruit is like, again, I primarily started off using fruit in lambic-inspired beer, and I was trying to keep all of my ingredients to a limited range of proximity. So it was like, how can I get the fruit from where I'm from as well? But with my quick sours, as well as just in general, like it's just a dogma. I can get over it sometimes, but I try to, with quick sours, I am willing to use more bizarre fruits that aren't necessarily from the region, because it's not really like that's not my focus, at least with these beers right now.
We gotta try tomatoes and onions and.
Oh, that'd be cool. I had a beer from an Indiana brewery that was a tomato goza that was actually probably one of my better like savory beer tasting experiences, because most of them I found not to be too good.
Is there a way to limit sourness?
Yeah, there is. So hops could help.
If I want to make a brown ale and I want just a touch of sourness,
Yep.
is there a way to get it to start and then shut it down?
Yeah. So you could adjust your target pH threshold. So you would need to, rather than being me, you would need to monitor that lactic acid fermentation, that period of time from when you added the lacto to when you tested it, just more frequently. So you could check it more frequently. Or again, hops are a way that you could control your lactose. So let's say you only wanted a little bit of lactic acid, you could play with the hop variable, maybe put it to 5 IBUs and see how much lactobacillus activity you create at 5 IBUs, or push it up to 7 because you're concerned really first and then maybe play with that variable.
So
So
how
it's
do you,
possible.
how do you stop the lactose? When you
Boil it.
So then you could boil it. You could boil it once you
Yeah, and, you know, if you don't want to monitor the pH, just taste it.
yeah, or you could just taste it.
I don't mind
Taste sour enough,
monitoring
boil
the
it.
Go ahead, John.
I just want to say that, you know, you were talking about getting passion fruit, and I know that, I can't remember who did it, but somebody at the club made a passion fruit beer. The way they did it was they went over to Dave's Mercado and Goya,
Oh, the
had
juice.
all kinds of crazy purees, juices.
No, but they have preservatives and that
Bottled,
stuff.
you know, they're obviously,
No, no, no.
nation stable because they, you know, so you can just jump it in afterwards if you want.
Yeah, no, that's not a bad idea at all. That definitely could accomplish that flavor. Go ahead.
They have a little more flavor than it's made about. So they actually, if you go to the freezer section, they have the frozen concentrate.
Oh, really?
Different like tamarind, passion fruit, all that stuff. So you can actually get that. I was looking at it today.
Where's that at?
At Dave's.
At Dave's Market.
The frozen food section. The frozen food section and the Hispanic section.
Okay.
This thing's right over here.
Yeah.
It's right over there.
Giant
No, it's right over
Mexican
there.
food section.
Okay. Awesome. No, those are great ideas. And I'm always open. Like that's one of the hardest part is finding good fruit. So cool. Mike.
My other fruit looking would be GFS.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So they actually sell like 5-pound bags of frozen
Costco's
Cherries, right?
Yeah, Costco would be another.
Cherries and berries and stuff.
Yeah, you can get like tart cherries or raspberries that are already frozen, and all it takes is dumping them in a cardboard.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time, and I hope you enjoyed something and are interested in trying to make some quick sour.